The onSecurity podcast aims to inform and challenge the viewer on all things cybersecurity. Our sponsor, Onshore Security, is a premier provider of full telemetry cybersecurity detection via its Panoptic Cyber Defense Service and managed security solutions.
Hello again. Welcome to the Onshore OnSecurity podcast. I am Stel, CEO of Onshore Security. And with us today, we have Kyle McNulty. Kyle, say hello to our audience.
Hey, everyone. Great to be here.
Kyle's coming from a very interesting space. But before we get into that, I want a shout out to Josh Ecklow, our producer. Yeah, thanks, Josh. Always keeping it on time and on budget. Thank you. So this time we brought Kyle over because Kyle's coming from an interesting corner of cybersecurity that we haven't covered yet. And frankly, a lot of people really don't cover because we're kind of in it, and that's media. So if you're out there looking for media about media, well, we could go down that rabbit hole, and we will. So, Kyle, let's give us kind of touch your background. I know you've worked in the space. You've been on the venture side too. So you're coming in with a bunch of background, and now jumped into media some, become somewhat of an expert there. Which I was all amazed when we had that conversation when we met. I'm like, okay, I've got to interview this guy. So give me some of that background so audience knows where you're coming from, like I do.
Yeah, absolutely. So started working in cybersecurity consulting about 5 years ago now. I was working at KPMG for several years, and that was where I first got my experience with just publishing content in the cybersecurity space. Obviously, as one of the leaders in the consulting world, publishing content as far as thought leadership, where the market's moving, what some of the best practices and key capabilities look like for different domains within cybersecurity is an important way that KPMG has been building their brand over the last decade or so. And about a couple of years ago now, it's been almost exactly 2 years, I launched my own podcast where I interview CEOs and founders at cybersecurity companies, specifically focused on the startup ecosystem and what these founders are going through as they're building their own ventures and what their backgrounds look like that have led them to this path. And so as we're going to talk about here today, I've seen a lot of these different veins of cybersecurity media, what it looks like, what that transformation has been over time, how these companies are prioritizing these different media opportunities as a way to really grow their advertising without having to dump more and more money into things like Google Ads, which over time we've just seen the efficacy of those drop significantly. So I'm excited to dive in further here.
Wow. So brand building as a goal, which is the long game for sales, let's call it, and marketing, but critical. I mean, even if you're a small brand, and then of course, I don't want to call it a converse, but sales is a goal, which advertising maybe kind of would address. I mean, all of that's in media. If you're talking about advertising, you're advertising in media. Give us the landscape and tell us where brand building kind of fits in, and maybe is less the top priority.
Sure. So just thinking through all the different segments of cybersecurity media that exist today, right? You still have spotlights on some of the major media channels. If you think about like the Ukraine-Russia conflict and how cybersecurity was at the forefront of that whole conflict in the early days, especially, then there were folks who were going on shows like CNBC and talking about the cybersecurity ramifications. So you still have those traditional news channels that are involved in this space, but I'd say to a less of an extent on a regular basis. Then you have all the different cybersecurity publications. So if you think about dark reading, which is kind of publicly sourced in a sense in terms of all the different authors that contribute, other cybersecurity specific publications, if you think about like Krebs on security, Schneier on security, those ones slightly more different as well because they're obviously more driven on those individual authors. So Brian Krebs, Bruce Schneier, and the reputations that they've built over time, just writing on this space for such a long period. But I'd say even more so if you think about the extension of those two individuals, it's all the independent practitioners that are publicizing their own thoughts on the space. So whether it's individual blog posts on, hey, how do you get started with a cybersecurity career? I'm sure we've all seen plenty of those posts on LinkedIn over the years now. Or
Mhm.
like, what are the top primers for application security? And that's either for a practitioner that's looking to work in that space, or for a CISO that's trying to make informed decisions in that space. You also have the kind of published sources such as Gartner, Forrester Wave reports, for example, talking about what does the tool market look like? What are these kind of cutting edge insights that companies are actually paying for through a subscription model in order to gain access to, and the sort of market research that they're able to use either to build their own brands from being published in those reports, or be able to consume those reports to make sure that they're staying on top of market trends. And even further, again, this list goes on and on and on. I won't claim to touch on every single one with an exhaustive list here, but if you think about all the podcasts that exist today, so we've already obviously covered 2 podcasts between Stel and I here, both with different focuses. But this is more of the kind of telling the security story, the founder story, the practitioner story, touching on overall landscape information. But you also have stories that are more focused on like specific cybersecurity events or cybersecurity lessons, or cybersecurity topics that are more maybe like education focused on specific for specifically practitioners. And so I think there's this whole range that exists today of storytelling from the business side, storytelling from the actual practitioner and technical side. And really that gamut that I just mentioned covers just about the entire cybersecurity world today.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I mean, for one, obviously mirrors generally what's going on in media. That's not the surprising part, but maybe give us a little bit about where it's different from all. I mean, there's the whole landscape. There's a whole media landscape. That you were also describing. Tell us where cybersecurity is different from the general media landscape.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because one of the first things that sticks out to me is traditional media. I think people are much more skeptical of independent sources that are
Hmm.
just publishing on a Substack, for example, and saying, hey, this is what's happening in like X country, or this is a perspective on X political issue. I think there's a lot more skepticism because of the polarization that exists around those topics that are traditionally covered by
Hmm.
the existing
Hmm.
media. In
Hmm.
cybersecurity, on the other hand, I think there's almost more trust in some of the independent media sources, which seems counterintuitive because cybersecurity is such an industry that's focused on mistrust and validating information. But I think there's more of a perception that people who are publishing and have credentialed backgrounds, which they can go and find on LinkedIn, that makes them reputable sources to talk about, again, some of those different examples that I mentioned, whether it's application security, cloud security, security monitoring. If someone has a background and actually works in those spaces, then they're probably more credentialed to be able to speak on it than someone who's just an independent journalist, maybe has no connection to Russia or Ukraine, and is then posting media's alleging what's going on in that world.
I love that because that's the way it should be. This is actually, think about how powerful that is. That there'd be, dare I say, a unity there. Like we're all in the same boat. We're all trying to solve the same problems. I mean, in fact, I've often, I'm kind of political myself, and I've often pointed out to people that, it doesn't have to be like this. I could tell you in like the business landscape. So, I'm a CEO. I mean, I also, had some exits in my past. So I do some angel investing. You and I've talked about, the whatever venture side of things too. And I love that world a lot because it's not polarized. I mean, we're just, if somebody wants to jump in on a deal that I'm working on, that's even better. I mean, there isn't like a kind of like a negative competition there. It's a positive, let's say, even maybe not saying they're very competitive. And in the cybersecurity space, what you're revealing to me on the media side of it, is what I see on the practitioner side, that even differing opinions are kind of very valuable to understand.
Right.
I'm not sure all the reasons behind that. It's not quite like a hobby thing, like knitting. Like if you're like, why would there be some conflicts in knitting? Damn it, the whatever loop, hook, that's the wrong thing to use here. I mean, they're not going to be polarized about it necessarily. So maybe there's an element of that, but no, I think there's something more to it. I think it's more, there's some kind of like mission commonality, you know, and and what would the ulterior motives be? Like maybe somebody who's cynical about like a provider trumping up some kind of like exposure to try to kind of generate business for themselves. And like, no, first one, we don't have to. I mean, it's out there. Um, uh, so maybe all these things conspire to make this kind of like, I'll call it a unity, whatnot. I see it in conferences. The conferences, I really feel like you're in the boat together. It's so positive. You don't even think about like the sensitivity of polarization you might in walking into even just a party. Like, oh, okay, I gotta be think about what I say, whatnot. But in the media, you're seeing that. That's awesome. Help me now with another kind of differentiator that trips me up a little bit. There's all kinds of. It's so easy to produce content yourself. So there's all kinds of self-produced content, and this is vendor-driven, whatnot. I believe there isn't necessarily cynicism or skepticism about that either. Hey, if it's useful content, they make an effort. And then there's things like Medium or something where you kind of self-publish, but you're on this on a platform. Can you give me some sense of how the value of those, or at least you see in the industry? Again, vendor kind of driven content, or using kind of a platform to self-publish versus more, let's say, professional content?
Yeah,
The value difference?
the short answer, as I'm sure you would expect, is it depends, right? Is there's some vendors that have very just explicitly self-promoting content that's kind of masquerading as, oh, this is information about the broader space. But then for anyone who's more familiar with the space, it's clear that the piece is just positioned as promotion. It's not really providing a ton of value to the reader other than just saying, hey, our product is the best. But there's also a host of vendors that are providing much more generally useful content and saying, hey, we recognize the true purpose of this form of publishing is to provide value to our readers or our listeners, whatever that media format might look like. Because if they associate our brand with learning something new, then that's going to lead to a positive reputation, right? So there's the whole spectrum there. And I think the same applies on Medium as well, right? You have some people who are posting on Medium and it's the 1000th article on like the top 3 things that you need to know about security monitoring, right? There's probably been more than 1,000 articles that have been published on that at this point in 2023. But there's also a lot of folks that are really going above and beyond, putting in the extra level of effort to publish things that are new, relevant, and really meaningful to their readers. And so I don't think it's fair to say that one is necessarily more valuable than the other. But that there's certainly a spectrum across each one, and it's being able to pick out, okay, which of these publishers are really providing valuable content and then sticking with them longer term. And I think that's part of maybe the allegiance that is interesting that exists within the cybersecurity space, where people who've been following Schneier on security now, for example, have been reading his newsletter for potentially 20 years at this point, given how long he's been in the space. And I think there's an inertia of when you subscribe to a newsletter, it's much more difficult to unsubscribe than it is to subscribe in the first place.
Where do you find, let's say, even more, I don't call it off the cuff, but lighter weight content like social media? I mean, cybersecurity kind of lives in Twitter a lot, though people have been moving to Mastodon lately. So where do you think that fits in? There's some of the same people are tweeting that are also blogging, et cetera, but even people that aren't even blogging that are just putting out tweets. Where do you see that in that value, differentiation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to clarify, right, that anyone who's making the effort to publish cybersecurity content, I think that's a great start. So I'm not trying to discount anyone and call their content lightweight. I mean, even someone who's publishing the article on top 3 things for security monitoring, there might be some new insights there. There might be some folks in your network who've never seen that content before. So there can certainly still be value. I think as far as the more specific question that you're asking there, as far as like where does social media and maybe some of these light touch pieces come in, is really the ability to consume that information quickly, right? I know from personal experience that the posts that I publish on LinkedIn, if I write a blog post on there, the vast majority of people who see that post are never going to actually read the article itself. right? And so what is the short form content that you're able to still convey to people, such as communicating the takeaway in just the kind of comment of the piece itself or the description of the article. And so I think there are a lot of people who just don't have the time to read every article that's written in the space, even from the folks that you subscribe to. And so Twitter or LinkedIn or Mastodon even all serve that same purpose of how can you consume the kind of high level gist of a piece of content or of a trend in the industry. And then the article serves as deeper follow up for the folks who really do need to go deep in that space.
Oh no, I get it, because it's kind of like the deeper it is, the more it looks like training rather than media,
Sure.
and a lot of times you're not about like I have the time or whatnot. It's just I'm going to choose how I invest my time, and I want to choose well. And consuming small bits allows you to vote quicker and move around, and at the expense possibly of missing out on some depth that could be valuable to you. Hopefully you have some process or something in your mind that would guide you there when you realize you need some depth. But I can tell you, when I've made the investment, oftentimes I've not been satisfied. Like I felt like
Mm.
I put a lot of time into going down a rabbit hole for something that it wasn't well targeted to me, like the value that I put out of it. So what I do value a lot is when it's curated, when there's people
Sure.
encourage this or that. And I guess social media does that a lot. Like, hey, you all should check out this article. Here's why. Maybe there's some discussion, whatnot. So yeah, it's kind of created a different landscape. And I'm actually more cynical about training than I am. I'm really not cynical at all about media. Actually, I am cynical about training. That a lot of it is not well targeted, extremely expensive. Um, not easy to do that kind of voting I described, where you can kind of test bits and determine kind of what's valuable. And the curators of it, let's call them, aren't, I don't want to say disingenuous, but not always totally genuine. And in some ways, I think the vendor part is the most genuine, because they're pretty clear and overt. Like, we want you to be using our product. Now, back in the day, I'm older than you. The vendor training was more of a revenue stream for them. These days, they want evangelists for their product. It's cheaper for them to provide training because it could be done online and whatnot. But yeah, so their agenda is a little purer, and so I appreciate that. You know what you're getting. As far as writing articles versus writing blog entries, I always felt that was a big burden, because anytime I had to write an article, or God forbid a white paper, oh my God, if I had to get a white paper going, like I had a whole team, that became, this giant effort for what? I mean, is it like, who really needs that depth? And I mean, maybe it's a good marketing piece. And is it really targeted? Is it, so it's more like training. So yeah, it's kind of like now it's shifted to like the media is fully a river. I mean, Twitter to me kind of busted that wide open and made that really clear. It's like, we don't even want you to write more than, whatever, what is it, 144 characters? I don't even remember what Twitter
Right.
is now. Because it doesn't matter. It's come and gone. You're never going to consume it all. You just kind of like work your own personal process, algorithms, whatever, to dip into the river as it flies by and take a sip.
And
So, but I'd like that as a selector. I like kind of, the way you're thinking about that there still is that depth available and various degrees of it.
right. And I think this is a trend that does apply across traditional media and cybersecurity media as well, right? We're just overall, the human attention span is getting a bit spoiled in terms of how it consumes information. And I'm completely guilty of this as well, right? Like my favorite newsletter just provides snippets where it's one sentence about a topic, which gives me some sort of high level overview. And then I can decide to drill further in if I'd like. And I think an interesting example in cybersecurity of this as well is with like the Gartner Magic Quadrant. Something I just learned several months ago now is that each Magic Quadrant has an accompanying report that's like 30 pages long, right? And most
Right.
people are not reading those longer reports. Everyone just sees the pretty little graph that says, okay, this is the leader in this space. And so part of the interesting piece, let me go ahead and turn the lights back on. I don't know
Yeah.
why those just timed out.
It's on a timer.
So as far as the Magic Quadrant, one of the interesting pieces about it is that they have this 30-page report behind it. And no one's actually reading this 30-page report. Everyone just sees the pretty little graph on the other side that says who's actually the leader in this space. And for the vast majority, there's this level of trust that comes with the organization of Gartner to say, okay, I trust that the research was put in behind this report, and so I trust the output of it. And so that brings in this whole piece of, does the lower attention span lead to a higher level of trust to begin with, because you're just making more assumptions with the different publishers of this content, and what are some of the ramifications of that trust as well, and how does the degradation of trust for some of these companies, again, Gartner is a great example, as there have been more criticisms as far as just the incentives for Gartner to place companies in these spectrums, the price that Gartner charges for different companies to actually have access to them. And so I think all these different elements are causing a lot of this mix up in the cybersecurity media landscape, and causing more folks to turn to some of those independent sources, whether it's the podcast, whether it's the blog post, and really pick the folks that they trust based off of their own experience, personal connections, references from friends, etc.
I mean, if as one of the goals of of that, of media and content in cybersecurity, of making kind of decisions about more products and vendors, more specifically, yeah, the water's muddy. I mean, it's hard for it not to be. I mean, so awesome that we don't have a polarization, that all information's good. Nobody's like a you know whatever, a disregarded or disingenuous kind of player as far as learning about cybersecurity, expanding our knowledge of the landscape and practices and where gaps or whatever. But yeah, but picking between vendors, yeah, that's going to be tough to not be muddy, not polarized, but just muddy. I mean, I use Gartner in for competitive analysis, so I may not read the whole report, but I'll cherry pick vendors that
Sure.
I feel we're up against, for whether we've been in competitive situations with them, or I can see us being in competitive situations, or they come up in conversation and I want to be able to talk about them, and I get some more depth, more than their websites give. This is, if anything I dislike about media, it's companies' websites. By the way, they're sort of strangely devoid of substance. But anyways, um, but Gartner gives you substance a little more, and you say, oh, here's what their offering entails, or here's how they're using that term. You know, that's another pet peeve of mine. Again, I don't know if that's a media thing. The terms that are the way they're used are not consistent. I mean, I've actually listened to blog posts just arguing about the use of a particular term, usually like a kind of like a practice or product name.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this is a complicated landscape. Was there some other comment you want to make in response to what I was saying?
I was just going to say that the acronym piece does play into the whole media landscape, right? Because there
Yeah.
is an element of being able to compare tools or capabilities using the same framework and the same structure. And if you do have
Yeah.
slightly different words, then you have companies that are saying, oh, we're not in this space, we're in that space instead. And so they're trying to kind of remove themselves from the comparison or from their competition solely with nomenclature, which then again creates a kind of interesting distinction between companies, and more of a challenge for buyers. So I would say that's actually one maybe disadvantage of all the independent voices, and where Gartner can be helpful is creating more kind of centralization and unity around, hey, what are we classifying this category as? Because if not, then all these founders are going to want to say that they're in completely their own category, and that they're super innovative and doing something that no one else is doing, even though that's maybe missing the broader point.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's wow. I don't want to say it's par for the course, but it's very prevalent. And let's not give all the weight to Gartner. Gartner is the big one. We all know it, but
To
there's
be sure.
IDC and there's Forrester and these other. Well, there's I can't remember the other name, was something with a number of research. I mean, there's other ones, and it'd be nice if it wasn't so dominant, because I think we probably get a little more kind of genuine practice. And I'm not terribly cynical about Gartner. I don't like that they carry so much weight, and kind of their definitions become like the leading ones, and they're not often that great. They leave some ambiguity. I mean, because who pays them? The vendors who are throwing those around and trying to always edge up and come up with another term and make themselves seem a little different. And anyway, I mean, I wish it could be better. I don't know how it could be, but maybe a little more even, spread on the research companies, might help that. Anyways, but the truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, all these, it's going to be this way. There's going to be a lot of different sources. There's going to be, vendors at play. There's going to be, third party providers. There's going to be individuals. I think their agendas are, to a good extent, are pretty, overt and transparent, which, I think lends itself to, the positive things we're seeing in the ecosystem. Um, Maybe one other thing that would be good to touch on, because we have a few more minutes, would be how this media plays into the venture side of things, because you have a lot of experience there too, and I'm sure you have some thoughts. Where is that used? What are the PE and the VCs behind some of these companies? Do they drive them in any particular direction? Do people leverage the media at all to play a game in the valuation space? I mean, we're talking about plenty of companies that, are, public even, and, running losses and whatnot. And, I'm sure there's got to be, an agenda for them there too. Any thoughts, Kyle?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think there's a lot to touch on as far as just the overlap between venture and media. But I think specific to cybersecurity, one of the interesting things about it, right, is there's a lot of folks who are on the investing side who don't have a hyper technical background when it comes to cybersecurity, right? There's a lot of folks on that side that have maybe founder experience, maybe even executive experience in cybersecurity companies. But as far as following the day-to-day technical trends of the cybersecurity market from a practitioner lens, that's much less common. And so my point here is that there's a lot of reliance on other folks within the security industry in order to understand, hey, this new tool that's being created by a fancy new startup over here, is this something that is actually needed by these different organizations? Is this something where the technology that they're promising in their seed round is something that's really going to be able to be built over the next couple of years and find product market fit a couple of years later? And so my point here is there's a lot of reliance from investors on all the different media sources that exist out there, whether that's super informal, so like reaching out to individuals in their own network and saying, hey, just give me your perspective on this, or if it's more like formal media, whether it's reading some of those different Gartner or any research reports like we just discussed, right? And saying, okay, here's this industry or area that I'm looking at investing in. What does Gartner say about the kind of market landscape, the key challenges that exist, the key capabilities that make these tools important and differentiated from one another? And that really informs a lot of the investment decisions that are made at the end of the day.
Wow. Yeah. I think it's a harder space to play in, to be honest with you, from what you're saying, because so many of these, early stage cybersecurity companies, especially, I see them coming out as more of a feature than a product. And, hey, their money behind them doesn't want to hear them talk about partnering with, this company or that company. They want to eat their lunch. And so, they keep digging in their little niche for way too long, but without creating the rest of the ecosystem. Yeah, we need like a framework, like a cybersecurity framework for just products. Yeah, that's a whole other topic I do want to cover, but we don't have time, and it's a different topic. So to our focus here, on onshore on security podcast is about let's stay focused on topic. So we'll probably talk again, more on this. But you've been awesome, Kyle. I have learned so much just from this short conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity, Stel. I think it was
Oh,
enjoyable just hearing your perspective on these different topics as well, right? Like we discussed before the episode, this is something that's very near and dear to our hearts based on our own roles in the media ecosystem, and something that's relevant for us to monitor and be on top of is how can we be better contributors to that ecosystem? How can we make sure that we're building that trust with our own listeners or content consumers, and make sure that we're, again, playing the role that folks are looking for in terms of just building out their media profile and information consumption for cybersecurity.
well, you said it. So yeah, you've convinced me.
Perfect. Thanks again.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. All right, well, there you go. There's another episode. Thank you, Josh Ecklo, for producing. Yeah, and we'll see you around next time. Bye, everybody.